Alrighty, and we are on to Eric King Watts on voice and voicelessness in rhetorical studies. And again, I'm operating out of the same book, but this is a good one, by the way. Rhetorical Criticism, Routledge Reader. I also have the actual one that you're looking at on my screen here, so I can hopefully figure out the pages that way. And this is an essay that I've taught for a number of years. I just really like the way he approaches this phenomenon, this concept of voice. I don't know that I've read anything else or that much on voice. And certainly nothing this, I think, nuanced and just like kind of nailing it. So this is the essay that I always go to when I think about voice and voicelessness. We talk a lot about voice. I've even used this term a lot with some of you talking about your topic ideas and your papers and what does it mean to have a voice? Where is voice? And so right off the bat, Eric King Watts. By the way, Eric King Watts, lovely guy. He was editing a journal that I was publishing a special issue in a while back, and I got to work with him. And he was just lovely and chill and friendly, and he was, and I believe still is, at University of North Carolina, which it's not in its heyday anymore, but it's a really strong program with great scholars. But the university has taken a beaten by the state over the last decade or so. So I believe he's still there and doing his thing. And we get to talk about the voice essay. So the bottom of the... it's like... This is the second paragraph here. Yeah, he asks a bunch of questions at the end of that second paragraph. He says, this... We use this term voice fairly regularly, and it clearly matters. It's connected to agency. There's some important aspect where voice is related to or interwoven with agency. Some may even say that is agency, right? Like all these different ways of thinking about agency and how it expresses itself. Voice is important, especially in a democracy, right? Like, your voice matters. Your vote is your voice, they often say. Like, voice your political opinions through your vote, right? And we can talk about voice in all kinds of other ways. Expression and as a way of articulating concerns. I remember when I used to teach my public sphere class. I haven't done it in a little while because things have changed so much, but I used to ask this question of, like, how do publics begin? Like, how do publics get going? If we understand public as this self-organized phenomenon that exists to address some kind of social problem. These are citizens that kind of organize sort of organically around a shared concern, whether it's poison in our water or minimum wage or whatever, right? You come together. The question is, like, well, how do they get going? And I used to argue, I still do, that everything begins with a shout. Some act of expressive frustration, anger. You can think about the shout in many different kinds of ways. Like, what would count as a shout? It can be a symbolic act and so on. But I think the shout is also a good way of thinking about this question of voice. What counts as voice? What is voice attached to? What is it not attached to? These are the kinds of questions he's asking here. So he says... Our conceptual confusion about voice is brought to light by some plain questions. For example, is voice a function of the linguistic, or is voice an original impulse of being? Does a text contain the author's voice? Or does a text always already house multiple voices? Or can a text be voiceless? Do speakers possess an authentic, identifiable voice? Or can speakers sound different voices? Right? Where is it? How many? Singular, plural? Is it in language? Is it in bodies? Is it in brains? Is it some other kind of ontological phenomenon that we harness and express through our artistic efforts, right? Big questions here. And I love his answer. I love where he ends up, and I love how he conceptualizes voice because it seems just right. It seems really, really productive and useful way of thinking about it, especially for us as rhetorical scholars who are interested in discourse and change and expression and galvanizing others to, join a cause and so on. So at the end of that first section, before the voice of the speaking subject, he gives his, lays it out, right? So he says, I posit the concept of voice as a relational phenomenon occurring in discourse. That's important right off the bat. It's a relational phenomenon. So as he'll say, voice is something that is that arises through like an encounter. And so it's sort of like, is it the chicken or the egg? Well, it's kind of both here. It's an encounter. And so it's a happening between sort of a speaking entity and a listening entity. So it's a relational phenomenon occurring in discourse. In this manner, voice is not reducible to a subject's agency. It's not just agency, although you could say that it's agential, right? That voice has an agential kind of capacity. Nor does it reflect a limitless range of signification. It's not just sort of like all of language or all of the symbolic that we create. It's just throbbing with voice everywhere, you know? Voice in this explication is constitutive of ethical and emotional dimensions that make it an answerable phenomenon. Thus, voice is the enunciation and the acknowledgement of the obligations and anxieties of living in community with others. So some examples that I think about off the bat, some examples that I've talked about in recent years are like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee in the football games. That is an act, an expressive act, that doesn't involve actual speaking. And yet I think it's very clear that this is an expression of a voice, right? I also think about the raised fist moment at the Olympics in the late 60s. I had a student write a paper on that moment, as drawing on this essay, actually, as like an act of invoicing, right? Finding a voice or expressing a voice. And it has all of these components to it. So what Watts is doing in these first few pages here is basically the usual thing of like, this is what we might think it is, but it's not quite this, and we might think it's this, but it's not quite that, and then he gets into it, right? So the kind of two things that are under consideration here is voice as utterance, like a physical utterance, like what I'm doing right now, I'm voicing, I'm uttering. That's attached to a physical body, it's spoken, it's material, it's performative, right? You can think about voice in that sort of concrete way. We got langue and parole. This is Bakhtin. These two ideas about langue and parole. And parole is speech, the act of speaking, and langue is like language as a whole. So you can think about voice being within language as a whole, and you can also think about voice being within the embodied subject uttering whatever, right? And he's suggesting that it's kind of both and neither and both, sort of somewhere in the middle, right? So in that first section, the voice of the speaking subject, the end of that first paragraph, he says, in this section of this essay, I delineate the conceptions of voice that reflect a tension between speech as a sensual, personal, and authentic phenomenon and language as an abstract, impersonal, symbolic system, right? So we got the this and the this. This is language, kind of just like the invisible, virtual kind of realm of signification and symbolicity. And you know, is voice in all of that? Well, sort of. But then you also have the kind of concrete individual speaking subject, announcing, maybe even not vocalizing, but like, you know, expressing. That's parole. That's speech and utterance, right? And so you have this and you have this, and he's sort of entertaining the ideas of like, is voice in here or is voice in there, right? And without sort of dragging through all of it, the answer is, again, it's sort of neither. And so we got to think about kind of the elements of both of these dimensions, this sort of axis of self and language, and find what's crucial there. So in the Comet's Tail section, for you, this is page 182. Right off the bat, he says, returning to the essential unity that voice shares with language allows one to compare voice to Bakhtin's notion of utterance as a primary genre, and utterance arises out of the daily flow of lived experience, and so utterance shares with voice an animated point of contact with life. Sorry, the good stuff is kicking in on 163 here. I got lots of ink on 163. So he's entertaining language and speaking subject. That's just what he was at there. 163 is where we kind of get the key stuff here. I'm sorry. 163 is the voice of the speaking text. which starts on page 183. At this juncture is where we want to be focusing. Yeah. At this juncture, it would be useful to clarify, in terms of voice, the tension between speaking and language. There we go. As the capacity of the speaking subject, voice emanates out of the distinct lived experiences of persons. That's important, right? Again, thinking about the public sphere stuff, the shout that kicks off a kind of potential movement, a galvanizing of fellow citizens around a shared, I call it an antagonism, a shared problem, a shared lack or tension or injustice, right? The shout is coming from someone's experience and someone's encounter with a problem, an injustice, right? So that's important. Voice emanates out of the distinct lived experiences of persons. Voice interrupts the ongoing flux of time and space by projecting the subject into it. The sound of one's voice bends space and time. So that actually works really well with that idea of the shout. If you know, you can think of the Kaepernicks taking a knee as a kind of a shout, and it bends space and time, right? It focalizes a nation's attention around that act, and questions get asked, and it's emotional, and it's ethical, and it has to do with acknowledgement. This is where he's headed. So that's important. The experience of voice jars us from the illusion of sameness and continuity that results from conformity and mindlessness in society. This disruption is perhaps similar to Nietzsche's will to power or Heidegger's call of conscience. One's voice entails one's capacity for moral agency. Voice is a puissant phenomenon. Cool. Excuse me. And then the next few lines here. As a function of language, however, voice becomes exponentially more pliable and more synthetic. Freed from its material and organic moorings, voice can signify identity across history and can be recollected from a diaspora. Metaphorically, voice operates as a vehicle for a set of cultural meanings that come into play in a text. So again, you can think about, like we read Shakespeare, we can talk about that voice, you know, that he carries forward over time and space in a text, in language. We still read people who've been dead for thousands of years, right? So voice carries forward through language. And again, this is the kind of the axes that we're dealing with here, is we got language which spreads across time and space, and then we have the embodied subject expressing. And voice is kind of stitched through both of these acts. The next paragraph, clearly concepts of voice arise out of, right in the middle there, he says, I have therefore attempted to do more than suggest that the term voice is polysemic, cracking along traditional lines between speaking and language and shaped as responses to domination. The differences in voice correspond to disagreements about not only the improper object of rhetorical study, but the ideological bent of criticism. He says, I am not here arguing about how voice is a mark of speaker authority and how it ought to look to icons for exemplars of magnificent speaking. At the end, he says, how can the notion of voice enhance rhetorical studies? Exactly, right? So if we get a handle on where it is, what it is, how it happens, then we can that helps sort of understand where agency is happening, where voice is happening, how we can track it and what matters there. Drawing from insights made by previous scholars, I argue, this is that next paragraph, I argue a voice is a particular kind of speech phenomenon that pronounces the ethical problems and obligations incumbent in community building and arouses in persons and groups the frustrations, sufferings, and joys of such commitments. Really important assertion right there. And a really great one, I think. Right? So voice draws attention to the ethics and emotions and tensions of what it means to be a member of a community. So a voice is an aspect of a communal kind of sense of belonging. Voice doesn't make a great amount of sense aside from one's place within a community. If you're on an island by yourself, does voice make sense, you know? This is a social, communal kind of phenomenon, so that's important. It's a linguistic phenomenon, but it's not equal to language. It's an embodied phenomenon, but it's not equal to embodiment, right? So he continues here. Rhetorical voice is not a unitary thing that inhabits texts or persons, either singly or collectively. It is itself a happening. There we go. That is invigorated by a public awareness of the ethical and emotional concerns of discourse. Saying that persons or groups have voice does not offer it as a unidirectional, primordial, and autonomous projection out of the body, nor does it become a semiotic project. Rather, Speakers can be endowed with voice as a function of a public acknowledgement of the ethics of speaking and the emotions of others. Voice, then, is the sound of specific experiential encounters in civic life. That's great. It's the sound of experiential encounters specific in civic life. That's about it. I mean, in terms of like what it is. But he's mentioned a few times now that it has this ethical, emotional dimension, and it also involves acknowledgement. So he goes through this example of W. Du Bois, "My country, 'tis of thee," as a kind of instance of voice in this way. And as he notes in that second paragraph in that section there, he says there are three interpenetrating aspects of voice illuminated by my critical approach. First, voice is energized by public reflections on the ethics of speech. Who gets to speak, right? What do you get to say? Where do you get to speak? When do you get to speak? All of these are potentially ethical kinds of questions related to the business of silence and being oppressed and being, having your voice muted, silenced, crushed, whatever, right? Second, voice is cultivated through shared emotions, right? So when Kaepernick took the knee, boy, did he arouse emotion. Pro and con. There was lots of like, how dare you? Show some, respect for the flag. And then you got a lot of like, yes, dude, say it. Say it. And in that simple act of just taking a knee, you say a lot. It's ambiguous, but there's a lot sort of attached to that. And all of this is kind of emotional to community building, community living, community management, right? Identity, collective belonging, who gets to be heard and seen, who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice. All right, so there's a lot of emotion there. And third, lastly, voice is actualized by public acknowledgement. And this is this business of a happening or an encounter. And I think that last piece is really important. There is this question of like, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it actually make a sound, right? Same kind of idea here. If someone takes a knee but no one's there to acknowledge it, voice doesn't really function. And so when I taught my public sphere class, I would ask the students, if someone shouts about a problem, but there's no audience to receive that shout, can a public take shape? The answer is essentially no, right? You can keep shouting, you can keep trying. But unless there's an acknowledgement, unless there's a reception and kind of repetition and iteration, an ongoing iteration, and it begins with an acknowledgement of that expression, of that voice, that utterance, right? And from there, if someone hears it, sees it, understands it, recognizes it, agrees with it, and also participates in that effort, in that symbolic effort, the shout, the organizing, whatever, now that voice has agential momentum, right? And so the agency of the voice is woven through the ethics, the emotions, but probably most importantly, that acknowledgement piece, right? And so how the acknowledgement is happening. Even if the acknowledgement disagrees with the voice, there's still an affirmation of it existing, right? And so there could be a negative emotion. Oh, Kaepernick should be kicked out of the NFL. Well, there's an acknowledgement at least, right? At least we're talking. At least there's a kind of response notion here. So I won't go through the examples. It's really interesting, good examples. I especially like this business of the little changes, the cough that he talks about. Under the ethics of voice, the first sort of subsection in the case study. This idea of like singing this national song, but doing it in a way where you're kind of like tweaking it, coughing. Reminds me of when I used to be forced to go to church when I was younger. And we have to stand up and sit down and stand up and sit down and sing this song. And everyone's just like, blah, blah, blah. And me and my teenage buddy Brandon, we would sit there and we would be like making fun of the singing. We would like singing like the old ladies with their high crackly voice. Oh, we would do that kind of thing just because we were bored and we were punks, and it was very rude and disrespectful. But we were also sort of like a silent protest, like we don't want to be here, this is dumb. And Brandon's aunt always used to sit behind us, and I could hear her giggling, like cracking up when we would do this kind of like old lady voice. And so that's sort of like the acknowledgement that kept affirming. And so we would just keep doing it, even though our parents would yell at us, like, stop doing that. They would be laughing and yelling at the same time. So it reminds me of the little changes, the cough, where you can kind of voice a dominant text, but in a different kind of a way, a sarcastic way. It's a little bit like Burke's notion of the comic stance, a little bit like a perspective by incongruity, where you're kind of going through the motions, but you're modifying it. And there's that kind of ethical, emotional agency that's happening with that reworking of the text, that performance of it. So it's a cool example. I'll let you read it on your own there, but I think the three dimensions stand on their own pretty well. So just at the very end there, the last paragraph, he says, the important point here is that voice is not detachable from a body, singular or collective, so it is attached to bodies. Similarly, it is always in excess of the body, presumed to contain it. So it's not equal to the body. I have proposed a notion of voice that concerns itself with the material or symbolic conditions of speaking and hearing. Constitutive of an ethical and emotional event, voice needs rhetoricians to explore the social commitments that speech entails, right? So it's this kind of cleave. Here we are in a community. Some of us don't have quite the presence and visibility, and we've been forgotten, or we've been suppressed and oppressed and badgered and belittled, or whatever the situation may be. We're frustrated, we're angry, we're invisible, and so we shout, right? Or we express that voice. But that's not the only part of it, right? So the ethics are reflecting on the very conditions of my utterance, and there's emotion running through all of this, always, right? Otherwise, why would we be speaking in the first place? But I like that last piece of it, is that this is an encounter. An encounter has to involve two entities, right? And so there's the speaking entity, and then there's the receiving or listening entity. And it almost doesn't matter so much what the response is or what the other side of that reception is. Acknowledgement is important, right? Because this is and frankly, that's what makes it all rhetorical, is the fact that this is something that's being sent out, that's being sort of sent up. But it's not really rhetoric until it lands and is received and something else happens. Maybe not, but hopefully so. Hopefully there's some kind of a response, some kind of a reaction. And that's all communal, ethical, emotional commitment generating and reminding, right? And so this analysis of voice gets us deep into the heart of some really important themes and terms and issues in rhetoric, having to do with ethics, having to do with community, having to do with agency, having to do with the symbolic and also the embodied, having to do with the self and the collective, right? So it's a super useful way, I think, of understanding this business of voice, which we talk about a lot, but we don't necessarily usually think about how it is that we're talking about it. So I love this essay. I love teaching it. I love talking about it. I love this way of thinking about voice. I think it's great. And hopefully you do as well. I think it's useful. I guess if there's one kind of final note, this was written back in the, I want to say early 90s, at a time when our kind of digital presences were not what they are today, right? Our kind of profiles online. And so I think if maybe a critical reaction paper could sort of think about this business of voice in a kind of digitally mediated and especially like anonymous, that whole phenomenon of anonymity and voice, do we need to update this for our kind of new digital, techno, social, platform-driven communal world, or does it still hold up just as well? I haven't really thought that through, but I think that's worth pondering, right? Is like how do we understand voice when there's such a disconnect between bodies and expressions in the digital realm? So you can think about that, chew it over, write about it if you want. There you go, gang. Hope this helped. Hope this was useful, and I look forward to further conversations. See ya.